June 1942, North Africa. An American armored tank emerges from the dust, its treads churning through sand, a small silhouette against the desert horizon. It wasn't impressive. No one would look at it and think, that's the enemy we should fear. But that's precisely where the terror lay. The M3 Stuart wasn't a war machine promising domination. It was something far more unsettling. It was truth materialized. For the German soldiers who faced it, the Stuart functioned as a mirror they refused to look into. Carl Jung taught us that every shadow projected onto an external enemy is a shadow that resides within ourselves. And that's the real reason the Stuart terrified them. It wasn't its armor, nor its armament. It was what it represented to the collective unconscious of the Third Reich's troops, the denial of everything they believed in. The Germans expected a war as their myths promised. They expected an epic battle between good and evil, between purity and degeneration. They expected their racial and technological superiority to guarantee victory. Their generals studied Napoleon's campaigns. Their strategists planned as if writing the continuation of a heroic saga. But the Stuart arrived like the trickster of ancient mythologies, that figure who doesn't confront the hero with honor, but defeats him with cunning, mobility, and sheer abundance. Statistics reveal something military history often ignores. Between 1941 and 1945, over 13,000 M3 Stuart tanks were produced. 13,000! For context, Germany produced approximately 2,300 Panzer IV tanks in the same period. While the Germans counted each machine as a precious resource that needed to yield unique and definitive results, the Americans offered quantity, replenishment, infinitude. For a nation that built its identity around the supreme quality of the Germanic people, confronting this reality was psychologically devastating. The first encounters with the Stuart in 1942 revealed disturbing narratives. German tank commanders described not just a military defeat, but a disintegration of certainties. A Panzerkommandant wrote in his diary, "It appears where we least expect it. There is always another, as if they are all the same, replicated, impossible to completely destroy." This isn't just a technical description. It's a projection of the unconscious, a description of how the shadow emerges when the ego can no longer deny it.
Jung warned us about the danger of a national psyche that projects all evil externally while denying its own flaws. The Nazi regime was a pathological case of this dynamic, an ideology that eliminated the capacity to integrate contradictions, that transformed any deviation into treason. And when reality began to contradict the founding myths, when the enemy proved not inferior but abundant, not weak but resilient, the collective psyche entered a crisis. The Stuart wasn't the most powerful tank. Technically, many German machines surpassed it in pure firepower. But this makes the phenomenon even more revealing. A technically inferior machine became a nightmare because it represented what Nazi ideology refused to integrate. That superiority is not determined solely by technical attributes, but by adaptability, mobility of thought, and unlimited resources. The Stuart embodied flexibility. German tanks embodied rigidity. And so we begin to uncover the hidden truth. The war in World War II was not just a battle of machines and strategy. It was a clash of collective unconsciousness. On one side, a psyche that refused to integrate its shadow, that believed in perfection through purification. On the other, a more disordered psyche, less ideologically pure, but fundamentally more adaptable. The Stuart was merely the tangible symbol of this psychological truth. What do you think about this perspective? Let us know in the comments below. Are wars really decided by machines, or by how men perceive and internalize these machines within their psyches? The first months of 1942 marked the encounter between two completely different psychological worlds. In the North African campaign, when Stuarts began appearing regularly in American ranks, German tanks expected an enemy that behaved like them, predictable, concentrated, hierarchical. Instead, they found something that defied all established military logic. The Stuart appeared where it wasn't expected. Multiple Stuarts. There was always more. A report from a German Oberleutnant, Friedrich Becker, describes a moment that perfectly illustrates this psychological dynamic. During the Battle of Gafsa in March 1943, his Panzer III unit faced what he believed to be a small American force. Within minutes, 5 Stuarts appeared from different flanks. When they destroyed one, 2 others had already targeted their position. Becker wrote, "It wasn't tactics, it was organized chaos."
It was as if the enemy wasn't afraid to lose machines, as if they knew there would always be another. This observation reveals something profoundly Jungian. Germany was facing not just a better equipped enemy, but a fundamentally different psychology. A psychology that accepted loss, that understood war as a numbers game, not a quest for perfection. The first survivors of combat against the Stuart began reporting disturbing patterns. German tanks that should have been superior by any technical parameter rarely managed to win a direct encounter with multiple Stuarts. And the reason wasn't a technical mystery, it was mobility, speed, adaptability. Concepts that German military doctrine, founded on precision and concentration of force, refused to value adequately. For the German mindset, a tank should be a moving fortress, concentrated firepower. The Stuart was the opposite. It was fluidity. It was multiple simultaneous points of attack. Carl Jung, in Psychology and Alchemy, describes how the psyche integrates opposites through a transformative process. But when a collective psychology refuses this integration, when it insists on maintaining only one side of the coin, the opposite side emerges destructively and uncontrollably. German soldiers saw in the Stuart exactly what their ideology had rejected: the imperfection that works, the multiplicity that triumphs, the strategy that abandons rigidity in favor of adaptation. The first medical and psychological records of German veterans from this period reveal something significant. Anxiety disorders related specifically to encounters with Stuarts. It wasn't just fear of combat, it was something deeper. It was the experience of confronting one's own powerlessness, one's own insignificance in the grand scheme of things. A soldier loses confidence when facing an enemy who seems invulnerable not due to superior design, but due to an abundance of replacements. How do you destroy an enemy that has infinite bodies? The shadow, according to Jung, is that part of ourselves that we reject and project onto others. The Germans had rejected the idea that quantity matters more than quality, that adaptation matters more than perfection, that survival matters more than honor. And now they faced an enemy that embodied precisely everything they had denied. The Stuart was the materialized shadow. Statistics from the first 18 months of combat show that German tanks destroyed proportionally more Stuarts than the other way around in direct engagements. But that barely mattered, because for every Stuart destroyed, 2 more appeared. The victory of one tank in a duel against another meant very little when the war was about attrition, about wearing down, about who had more machines to throw into the fray. What do you think about this? In a war, can technical perfection truly overcome adaptable abundance? Let us know in the comments. Between 1943 and 1944, something fundamentally changed in the psychological perception German soldiers had of the Stuart. It was no longer just a tank. It was a living symbol of a truth that refused to disappear. The first challenges faced by German troops weren't merely technical or tactical. They were existential. It was the daily experience of realizing that what you had been taught to believe did not correspond to the reality you faced. A German soldier named Hans Müller left extraordinary personal records about his combat experience against Stuarts in Sicily in 1943. Müller had undergone rigorous military training. He had absorbed the ideals of superiority instilled in him since childhood. But when his eyes first saw a Stuart move with a speed his Panzer III couldn't match, something broke inside.
He wrote in his diary, "Today I understood that our myths are not truth, and that is more terrifying than any bullet." This is the psychological transition Jung described as the confrontation with the shadow, the moment when the conscious mind is forced to recognize what it denies. The statistics from this intermediate period are revealing. Between 1943 and 1944, German production of Panzer IV tanks increased significantly, a desperate attempt to compensate for numerical inferiority. But while the Germans produced dozens, the Americans produced hundreds of Stuarts. The ratio remained impossible. In 1943, for every German tank destroyed, Germany lost a finite and irreplaceable resource. For every Stuart destroyed, the Americans produced 3 new ones. This was the mathematical truth no ideology could deny. What makes this profoundly Jungian is the transformative irony that emerges in this period. The Germans expected racial superiority to guarantee military superiority. They expected Germanic perfection to translate into inevitable victory. But reality revealed something disturbing. Victory belongs not to the pure,
but to the abundant, not to the perfect, but to the adaptable. The Stuart, in its imperfection, in its simplicity, in its easy replicability, was more lethal than any technically superior machine. Personal accounts of initial survival begin to emerge in this period, but with a peculiar psychological quality. German soldiers who survived combat against Stuarts often described not a sense of victory, but a sense of imminence, as if they knew that defeat was inevitable and that each day of survival was just a postponement. An Obergefreiter named Wolfgang Krause reported, "Destroying a Stuart brings us no relief. It only makes us aware of how many more exist beyond the horizon." This is the psychological experience of confronting the trickster archetype. The trickster cannot be defeated by brute force. He only gets worse when you try to destroy him directly. The environments changed, but the emotional experience remained. In Normandy in 1944, German soldiers again faced Stuarts. The landscape was different, the season had changed, but the feeling was identical. Multiple enemies, infinite resources, the inevitability of defeat. The desert sand had been replaced by the mud of Western Europe, but the psychological dynamic remained unaltered. Traditional heroism, that which Jung described as the hero archetype facing evil directly and honorably, simply didn't work against the Stuart. Because the Stuart wasn't an adversary that could be honorably defeated. It was a force of nature, a materialized economic reality, the tangible manifestation of abundance facing scarcity. Tell us in the comments where you're from and how your culture might value this psychological battle between perfection and abundance. Mid-1944, the psychological tension the Stuart had created reached a point of no return. It was no longer a matter of military tactics or technical superiority. It was an existential crisis that manifested in the eyes of every German soldier receiving field orders. The machine had become a symbol of impending apocalypse. And this is the moment when psychological influences in the conflict ceased to be subtle and became evident even to military commanders. German command records from this period reveal a significant linguistic shift. Generals began using terms like American avalanche and deluge of machines to describe the situation. This was not rhetorical exaggeration. It was the language of the collective unconscious emerging through official channels.
It was the recognition, however disguised, that they were facing not just a military enemy, but a force that transcended traditional combat logic. In Man and His Symbols, Jung describes how individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself through conscious and unconscious integration, is essential for both individual and collective psychic health. A nation that refuses this process, that insists on maintaining an image of itself that contradicts reality, inevitably moves towards psychological fragmentation. And that's exactly what began to happen in the German collective psyche between 1944 and 1945. The ordinary German soldier lived an unbearable contradiction. On one hand, they were told that victory was certain, that Germanic superiority was incontestable, that defeat was impossible. On the other hand, they saw Stuarts, multiple Stuarts, multiplying, impossible to stop. This contradiction between propaganda and reality didn't just create tactical frustration, it created a fracture in the very capacity to make sense of experience. How do you integrate the experience of defeat when you've been taught that defeat is ontologically impossible for you? A Feldwebel named Otto Richter left personal records that perfectly illustrate this breaking point. Richter had spent years believing in the regime's ideals. He had genuine conviction in his cause. But in 1944, after repeatedly confronting Stuarts on different fronts, something radically changed in his perception. He didn't become a deserter or a traitor. He simply recognized that something was fundamentally wrong. He wrote, "The myths they taught us don't correspond to the world I see. And if that's true, what else isn't true?" This seemingly simple question is the peak of forced individuation. It is the moment when the psyche can no longer deny reality. The psychological influences at this point of the conflict were multiple and intertwined. There was the rational fear of military defeat. But there was also something much deeper, the experience of having one's fundamental psychological identity questioned by material reality. The Stuart didn't just defeat German tanks, it defeated narratives, it defeated myths. And myths, Jung taught us, are psychic structures far more fundamental than any military strategy. Statistics from the last 18 months of the war show a cruel pattern. While German tank production drastically decreased due to lack of resources and bombed infrastructure, American Stuart production continued relentlessly. By 1945, Americans were producing more tanks per month than Germany had produced in the entire year. This was not just a military imbalance. It was the physical materialization of psychological collapse. And here's the critical point. At this moment of preparatory climax, the German soldier began to understand that victory was no longer a matter of better tactics or superior determination. It was a matter of acceptance. Acceptance that reality did not correspond to myths. Acceptance that, perhaps, the myths never did. And this acceptance was, simultaneously, the psychological death of everything they believed in. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next videos, where we'll explore how this psychological crisis manifested in the final stages of the war. 1945, spring. The European landscape was gray, destroyed, covered by the smoke of incessant bombings. And amidst this ruin, the sound. The sound every German soldier had learned to recognize with deep terror. The rumble of multiple Stuart engines approaching. This sound wasn't just auditory. It was a psychological vibration that penetrated to the thalamus, activating survival circuits that no training could deactivate. It was the sonic materialization of inevitability. A German tank crewman named Klaus Weber left personal accounts from the final months of combat that illustrate the psychological peak of this dynamic. In March 1945, in Bad Nauheim, Weber found himself surrounded by 5 Stuarts. His Panzer V Panther, considered technically superior, couldn't move from its position. And as he watched the Stuarts maneuver, circling him, something extraordinary happened in his psyche. Weber didn't just feel fear, he felt admiration. Not admiration for the enemy, but confused admiration for what his enemy represented. The victory of multiplicity over singularity, of abundance over scarcity, of adaptation over rigidity. Weber documented, "I saw 5 small, seemingly fragile machines maneuver in unison in a way that my Panther, superior in everything, could not replicate. And I understood something in that moment. We were taught to be unique, to be individually perfect. They were taught to be a collective organism. We lost because we insisted on being heroes. They won because they accepted being merely parts of something larger." This is the alchemical analysis of the mind that Jung described.
Alchemy is not just material transformation. It is a transformation of perspective, of understanding, of the integration of opposites. The statistics from the last months of the war are brutal. Between January and May 1945, German tank losses reached approximately 1,800 units monthly. Production? Zero. No new tanks rolled out of German factories. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to produce hundreds of Stuarts monthly. It was pure math. It was the end, and every soldier knew it. But what makes this phase truly critical is something that transcends tactics. It is the alchemical transformation Jung described in Psychology and Alchemy, the nigredo, the putrefaction, the point of psychological death. German soldiers had gone through the albedo, the whitening, the confrontation with truth. Now they were in the nigredo, the complete recognition that everything had disintegrated, that the myths were just myths, that purity was merely an illusion, that defeat had been written not in 1942, but in the ideological foundations of the regime that sent them to war. A survivor named Dieter Hoffmann reported the moment his platoon was destroyed by 3 Stuarts in April 1945. Hoffmann, an educated man, a professional soldier, described not the physical pain of his wounds, but the psychological pain of understanding. He wrote, "When the shells hit us, I felt no anger, I felt relief. Because what was killing us was what should have killed us a long time ago, reality. And now reality could no longer be denied." The stories of overcoming at this peak of the conflict ceased to be stories of victory and became stories of acceptance. Soldiers who managed to retreat and survive another day, another week, did not do so motivated by hope of victory. They did so purely and simply because the instinct for survival was stronger than any narrative. It was the most primitive aspect of the psyche, what Jung called the reptilian aspect, the limbic system overriding all the cortex that had been programmed with ideology. Tell us in the comments, do you believe a rigid psychological system can overcome an adaptable one? Or is adaptation always superior? May 1945. The Third Reich had vanished. But the war didn't end merely with signatures on official documents. It ended first in the minds of the men who lived it. And this psychological death left scars that no official peace could completely heal.
The first months after the German military collapse revealed something extraordinary. Many surviving soldiers did not feel the expected emotion of relief at their survival. They felt emptiness, disorientation, as if the psychological structure that had kept them functioning throughout the war, even in its most desperate and negative form, had disappeared along with the defeat. An American psychologist named John Dos Passos documented interviews with German prisoners of war shortly after the surrender. He reported something disturbing. Many men asked to remain prisoners, not out of fear of judgment, but because the structure of captivity was more understandable than the chaotic freedom that was approaching. This is the immediate psychological consequence of what Jung called psychic death, followed by the possibility of rebirth. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung describes how putrefaction is not just destruction. It is the necessary first stage for real transformation. The man who believed in myths for years cannot simply stop believing. He experiences something analogous to grief, first denial, then anger, then depression, finally acceptance. And during this progression, the individual is profoundly vulnerable, fragmented, unable to reconstruct identity while the old myths still occupy psychological space. A soldier named Ernst Keller, who survived multiple battles against Stuarts, left extraordinary personal records about his process of psychological recovery. Keller spent months in an American prisoner of war camp, and during that time, something surprising happened. The Americans did not torture him. They did not convert him through propaganda. They simply left him in peace. And in this forced solitude, Keller began to confront the questions the war had left hanging.
He wrote, "For the first time in years, I could think without someone telling me what to think, and I discovered that my thoughts were empty. Empty because they had been completely replaced by doctrines that did not correspond to the reality I lived." The chronological transitions of the post-war period reveal a consistent psychological pattern in many German veterans. Those who could moved to new regions, tried to rebuild lives in cities where no one knew them as soldiers, as participants in the regime, as defeated. There was an almost desperate need to reinvent identity, because the old identity was irremediably compromised.
The final irony in this period is almost brutal in its symmetry. The men who were taught they would die for the purity of their race were saved, paradoxically, by the abundance of those they considered inferior. The Americans won so completely that they could afford compassion. They could feed prisoners of war. They could let them live. The Germans, in the same inverted situation, would have executed them. This fundamental psychological difference, this American capacity to integrate compassion with victory, while Germany only knew victory or total destruction, was perhaps the true difference between the two psyches. A 1946 account by a psychiatrist who worked with German veterans described consistent patterns: post-traumatic stress disorder, but with a different quality. It wasn't just combat trauma. It was existential trauma. These men had lived through psychological death. They had seen their myths disintegrated, and now they needed to reconstruct meaning from the rubble. The resilience that emerged from this process, however, was profound. Because those who could integrate the experience, who could admit they had believed lies, who could confront the shadow they had projected onto the enemy, discovered a humanity that transcended ideology. They discovered individuation through suffering. Share this with a friend or family member who you think needs to hear this story, because it's not just history, it's human psychology in its rawest state. Decades after the war ended, military historians continued to debate the technical effectiveness of the M3 Stuart. They compared armor, weapon calibers, speeds, but they completely missed the point. Because the true legacy of the Stuart isn't in its technical specifications, it's in how it functioned as a catalyst for a collective psychological transformation that reverberated through generations. The final statistics of the war are revealing, but only to those who know how to interpret them through a psychological lens. Approximately 13,000 M3 Stuarts were produced during the war. Of these, fewer than 1,000 were lost in direct combat to German tanks. The majority were destroyed by artillery, anti-tank mines, armed infantry, or in accidents. The casualty ratio, therefore, doesn't tell the true story. The true story is that the Stuart was practically indestructible not because it was invulnerable, but because it was endlessly replaceable. Because there was always more. Because it represented a type of victory that didn't depend on individual heroism, but on a systemic capacity for production. This is fundamentally a psychological truth, not a technical one. And Jung had already identified this when he wrote about how the individual psyche can be subordinated or liberated by the collective psyche. Germany had built a collective psychological structure based on individual heroism, on Germanic excellence, on the superior man's ability to win through willpower and purity. The United States, in turn, had built a collective psychological structure based on abundance, on the capacity for mass production, on victory through organized quantity. The clash between these two psyches materialized not in ideology, but in metal, in the Stuart. One of the deepest aspects of this psychological war is how it forced an integration of the German shadow. The shadow, according to Jung, is that part of ourselves that we reject. Germany had rejected ordinary humanity, imperfection, the capacity to err and continue living. It had rejected the idea that victory could be less glorious, less epic, less individual. And when confronted with an enemy that embraced precisely what it had rejected, the German collective psyche entered an existential crisis.
But here's the most disturbing and most important truth. This existential crisis, this psychological death and subsequent need for rebirth, was essential for the psychological reconstruction of post-war Germany. The old myths could no longer function. The ideology that had sustained the war had completely disintegrated. And in that void, there was space for something new. For a psyche that could integrate its own shadows, that could accept ordinary humanity, that could recognize that excellence doesn't need to be accompanied by racial purity. Many German veterans who lived through this process of psychological death and rebirth became, paradoxically, among the most psychologically sophisticated citizens of the post-war era, because they had experienced illusions so completely, so devastatingly, that they could never again live in a reduced reality. They had seen the shadow materialized in the form of an armored tank, and that vision was indelible. The final psychological legacy is this. The M3 Stuart didn't win the war alone, but it was a perfect instrument, almost as if it had been conceived by the collective unconscious itself, to materialize the psychological transformation that needed to happen, because Germany could not have been rebuilt until its people had experienced a psychological death so complete that the ancient myths became impossibly obsolete. The final human casualty figures tell a story of millions. But the story that truly matters, the story that continues to resonate through the decades, is the story of how a small, seemingly fragile machine forced the minds of powerful men to confront their own mortality, their own finitude, their own possibility of being wrong. Goethe, the German poet, once wrote, "Nothing is more terrible than ignorance in action." The Stuart didn't just eliminate tanks, it eliminated ignorance. And for a psyche that had built its fortress on ignorance, that was truly apocalyptic. Comment below, do you believe true victory in war is military or psychological? When you look at photographs of destroyed German and American tanks side by side, one thing is immediately evident. They are indistinguishable. Both were burned, punctured, disintegrated by the violence of war. But there is a crucial difference that no photograph can capture. The destroyed German tanks represented the loss of finite, irreplaceable resources. The destroyed American ones represented the loss of one among many, an interchangeable part in an immense organism. And this difference, seemingly technical, was profoundly psychological. The M3 Stuart, in the end, was not an exceptional tank. It was, in many respects, inferior to its German contemporaries. But its technical inferiority was its psychological superiority, because it functioned perfectly as a symbol of what Nazi ideology refused to accept, that victory doesn't come from the perfect individual, but from the adaptable system, that strength doesn't reside in purity, but in flexibility, that true power is not concentrated at one point, but distributed through multiple centers of power. If you follow the Jungian line of thought to its logical conclusion, you'll see that World War II was, in essence, a battle between two forms of collective psyche trying to manifest through machines and strategy. On one side, a psyche that insisted on denying its shadow, that projected all imperfection onto the other, that built identity through denial. On the other, a more chaotic psyche, less ideologically coherent, but fundamentally more capable of integrating contradictions.
The Stuart was merely the instrument through which this psychological truth materialized. In the 80 years that followed the end of the war, historians produced thousands of analyses on the reasons for the German defeat. They talked about the Russian campaign, about strategic bombing, about tactical errors, about resources. But they rarely talked about what truly broke the will of the German soldiers, the daily experience of confronting their own insignificance, the experience of realizing that no matter how well trained they were, no matter how pure they were in their Aryan identity, it did not make them indestructible, that there was something larger, more abundant, less refined, but fundamentally more powerful. The final numbers of the war confirm this psychological truth. Germany, with all its technical excellence, produced approximately 8,000 panzer tanks of all types throughout the war.
The United States produced over 49,000 tanks, including the Stuarts. This ratio of almost 6 to 1 is not just a military advantage. It is an ontological difference. It is the materialization of the difference between a nation that believed in scarcity and one that believed in abundance, between one that valued the unique hero and another that valued the collective system. And here's the point that completely transcends military history. This psychological difference remains. It remains in the veterans who returned home. It remains in the psychological scars that never fully healed. It remains in the subsequent generations of Germans who had to rebuild identity from the rubble of the old. Jung described the process of individuation as one in which the conscious integrates the unconscious, in which the ego recognizes the existence of the shadow and works to integrate it. Germany was forced, through war and defeat, to do exactly that on a collective scale. It was forced to recognize that the myths it embraced were exactly that, myths. That reality had a much more complex, much more contradictory texture than what had been taught. The Stuart, in this sense, was an instrument of salvation disguised as destruction, because it eliminated the possibility of Germany continuing to live in illusion. It forced it to grow or perish. And those who chose to grow, who managed to integrate the traumatic experience and transform it into wisdom, became something their predecessors never were, fully human.
The final statistics speak of 5 to 6 million German soldiers killed or missing. They speak of destroyed cities, annihilated infrastructure, a divided nation. But the statistic that truly matters, the one no history book can adequately tell, is how many surviving soldiers managed to transform their psychological death into genuine rebirth. How many managed to integrate the shadow they saw materialized in armored tanks. How many managed to become what Jung called the integrated self, one who embraces both light and darkness, both virtue and error, both victory and defeat. Carl Jung, reflecting on the wars of the 20th century, wrote something that remains profoundly relevant. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Germany lived this truth devastatingly. Its collective unconscious, the one that believed in superiority through the denial of the shadow, drove it to the precipice. And it was only by completely confronting this unconscious reality, through defeat, through infinitely multiplying armored machines, that the possibility of genuine choice could emerge. The M3 Stuart was just metal, explosives, and fuel, but it was also a mirror. And in that mirror, soldiers and nations saw the truth that their myths refused to reveal. And that truth, however painful, was essential. It was the first step towards true individuation. This is the story no military book can fully tell, but now you know it, and it changes everything. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming analyses that explore how psychology shapes history. Comment below what you think about this Jungian perspective on war, and share this video with someone you think needs to understand that the most important battles are those fought within the mind.